G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session 13 of the book of Jeremiah. We're looking at chapter 20, verse 1 down to chapter 21, verse 14. Just a quick recap on the last session, which was last year. We had the symbol of the broken bottle. Jeremiah was to go and buy a potter's earthen bottle, and he was to take two groups of elders along with him, and he was to go down to the valley of the son of Hinnom, and there he was going to proclaim to them the words of God to them. Basically, he was going to be dealing with the problem taking place in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, which was human sacrifice. This is being practiced by Israel, by Judah, and that was in the valley of Hinnom. And Jeremiah says to them, it's no longer going to be called either Tophet, which is his other name, or the valley of the sons of Hinnom, but it's now going to be called the valley of slaughter. Why? Because the decision made by the elders, by the religious leaders in Israel, brought on the judgment was because they were worshiping Baal, and part of their worship to Baal was that they were offering human sacrifice to Baal. And God is going to cause them to fall by the sword of their enemies and by the hands of those who seek their lives. So God is saying to them that their dead bodies will lie unburied and will actually become food for the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the earth. So after prophesying to these elders, Jeremiah then broke the bottle in their sight, and that signified to the people that they are going to be equally broken as one breaks a potter's vessel. And once that vessel is broken, it can't be put back together again. So once they are broken, there'll be left nothing but captivity. This is Judah. So they're going to be burying in Judah, burying in Topheth, or the sons of, or the valley of slaughter, until there's going to be no more place to bury. Now, we know that with the Babylonian attack, that wasn't the case. There was a lot of dead, but actually the time when this actually will be fully fulfilled, what it really was when in the Roman invasion of Israel, when there were over 1.1 million killed at that time. That was in AD 70. Now, Jeremiah was then commanded to leave the valley, go up to the temple mount, to the temple compound, and there he's going to tell the people exactly the same prophecy. So that's where we're up to. The bottle has been broken, and now we're going to see the response now of the people. And we're going to see the rejection of this message in chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. Now, Pashhur, the son of Immer, the priest, who was chief officer in the house of Jehovah, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things. Then Pashhur smote Jeremiah the prophet and put him in the stocks that were in the upper gate of Benjamin, which was in the house of Jehovah. We'll just leave it there for the minute. Now, the message is rejected in a very graphic way, because in verses 1 to 2, Jeremiah was imprisoned for his message that he spoke back in Jeremiah 19, verses 14 to 15. And the person responsible for putting him in prison was a priest by the name of Pashhur, and he was a son of Immer. Now, this was a very common name for the priests. In fact, after the captivity, the name Pashhur, you can find it in Ezra 2, verse 38, and Nehemiah 7, verse 41. Now, Pashhur's father's name was Immer, also a common priestly name. And that you can check that out in 1 Chronicles 24, verse 14. And that was before the captivity, 1 Chronicles 24, 14. And after the captivity, we find it in Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra 2:38, Nehemiah 7:40. Okay, so Pashhur, the position that he held was he was a chief officer in the house of Jehovah. So what was that? What does that mean? Well, he had the responsibility of keeping the peace in the temple compound. And he heard Jeremiah prophesying in chapter 19, 14 to 15. And as far as he was concerned, Jeremiah was disturbing the peace. Therefore, I need to lock him up. And in verse 2, Pashhur did two things against Jeremiah. First of all, he struck him. And this beating may have included the 40 lashes of Deuteronomy 25:3. Deuteronomy 25:3 says that 40 stripes he may give him, he shall not exceed. And in actual fact, we see the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 11:24. 2 Corinthians 11:24 says that 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. So he means he got 39 lashes because they couldn't go past 40. So instead of going past 40, they'd stop at 39 just to make sure. Second, so that's Jeremiah beaten. Second, he was placed in stocks. Now, the root Hebrew word for stocks means to turn or to overturn. So this means that Jeremiah's body was forced into an abnormal, contorted position. His hands and feet may have also been restrained. And in actual fact, most likely, he was put into some sort of a box or some extremely confined space that would have forced him to stay in a very cramped position for the whole night. Jeremiah 29, verse 26, we'll see this later on. Jeremiah 29, verse 26. And also 2 Chronicles 16:10. 2 Chronicles 16:10 and onwards, you see a bit about this type of punishment. Now, the verse further explains that Jeremiah's place of confinement was in the upper gate of Benjamin. Now, that's the gate that led into the temple compound. Now, this gate is not the city gate of the same name. They're two different gates, but they're named the same name, upper gate. This is in the temple compound. This is not the city gate. In verse 3 and 4, and it came to pass on the morrow, that's the next day, that Pashhur brought forth Jeremiah out of the stocks. Then said Jeremiah unto him, Jehovah has not called your name Pashhur, but Magor-missabib. For thus says Jehovah, behold, I will make you a terror to yourself and to all your friends, and they shall fall by the sword of their enemies, and your enemies, and your enemies shall behold it, and I'll give all Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall carry them captive to Babylon, and shall slay them with the sword. So, what's this all about? Well, verse 3 says, the next day he was released after undergoing torture all night, and being released now, Jeremiah had a message from God to Pashhur. Pashhur is about to receive a new name, and his new name will be Magor-missabib, or terror on every side, or terror round about. Now, Jeremiah already used this term back in Jeremiah 6, verse 25, and he uses this term in several other places in his book. It's also going to be applied to Jeremiah later in verse 10 of this chapter here. It will be mentioned again in chapter 46, verse 5, and chapter 49, verse 29. 46, 5, 49, 29, and also the book of Lamentations in chapter 2, verse 22, Lamentations 2:22. So outside of Jeremiah's writings, this term Magor-missabib is only found one other place. It's found in Psalm 31, verse 13. Otherwise, this term is very unique to Jeremiah only. Now, Pashhur's name change was appropriate because, as verse 4 shows, the priest was to become a terror, both to himself and to his friends. Now, in what way he'll be a terror to his friends, we're going to see in verse 6. Now, in verse 4, they are destined to fall by the sword of their enemies, and Pashhur's eyes will behold it. And God says, I'll give all Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. At long last, we now know the specific nation that is going to come against them. The place of the captivity will be in Babylon. Up to now, the specific place of the captivity had only been hinted at by references to the north. Remember, the enemy was coming from the north, and Jeremiah's own 2 round trips, which he made previously to Babylon to bury and unbury the linen girdle. So now we know it's going to come from Judah, is going to be exiled to Babylon. Verse 5 says, moreover, I will give all the riches of this city and all the gains thereof and all the precious things thereof. Yes, all the treasures of the kings of Judah will I give into the hand of their enemies, and they shall make them a prey and take them and carry them to Babylon. So the wealth of Jerusalem in verse 5 will become a spoil for the Babylonians. Both the wealth of the city and the royal house will become this spoil for the Babylonians. And then Jeremiah goes on to say, and you, Pashhur, and all that dwell in your house shall go into captivity, and you shall come to Babylon, and there you shall die, and there shall you be buried, you and all your friends to whom you have prophesied falsely. So Pashhur's treatment of Jeremiah would receive just recompense, for he and his house would be taken captive to Babylon, and there they would die and be buried. Now his friends will also go into captivity, and the reason that Pashhur will become a Magor-missabib to his friends is because he prophesied falsely to them. And these very friends to whom he prophesied falsely and who actually chose to believe his false prophecies and rejected the true prophecies of Jeremiah, in that sense, he'll become Magor-missabib to his own friends because all his prophecies are going to fail. Now, when Jehovah declared his decree about Pashhur's punishment, he emphatically stated that neither the priest nor his friends would be buried in Israel. Now, the rabbis considered this an especially grave punishment because, according to the Talmud, being buried in Israel may atone for one's sins. That's what they believe. For a Jew to be buried outside his own land was considered a judgment, for the Gentile lands were considered unclean. Okay, there's a lot more that the rabbis have to say about that, but we won't go into that. Now, this prophecy regarding Pashhur was fulfilled in 597 BC during the second of the 3 deportations to Babylon. Remember, 604, 605, 597, and then final one, the third one, 586 BC. Now, this deportation is mentioned in 2 Kings 24, verse 15. And he carried away, this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, and his officers, and the chief men of the land carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. This is the same deportation that took Ezekiel into captivity. Now, an important passage that allows this accurate dating is Jeremiah 29, 25 to 26. Jeremiah 29, 25 to 26. Thus speaks Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, because you have sent letters in your own name unto all the people that are at Jerusalem, and to Zephaniah the son of Messiah, the priest, and to all the priests, saying, Jehovah has made you priest in the stead of Jehoiada the priest, that there may be officers in the house of Jehovah. For every man that is mad and made himself a prophet, you should put him in the stocks and the shackles. Why am I telling you this? Well, because by the time of Jeremiah 29, that's Jeremiah chapter 29, the officer of the temple was now Zephaniah and not Pashhur. So by this time, the prophecy of chapter 20, verses 5 to 6 regarding Pashhur had already been fulfilled. And the second deportation must have taken place sometime between Jeremiah 20 and Jeremiah 29. So this prophecy of Jeremiah was fulfilled very quickly. This is pertaining to Pashhur. In verses 7 to 18, Jeremiah has another lamentation, and this is going to be divided up into 3 sections. And the first section we see is Jeremiah's despair. Jeremiah, we see, is despair in verses 7 to 10. He first of all, he prays a prayer of despair. Now, remember, back in chapter 1, we read that Jeremiah did not seek the prophetic office. He was pressed into it. And now in the first part of verse 7, the prophet lamented, "O Jehovah, you have persuaded me, and I was persuaded. You are stronger than I and have prevailed." So, what's he saying? Well, the Hebrew term for persuaded, which is patah, P-A-T-A-H, means to allure, and it has a connotation of being enticed or seduced. So what Jeremiah is saying is Jehovah had enticed him to go on his mission. And being the stronger one, he had taken hold of the prophet and accomplished what he set out to do through him. Jeremiah didn't want this job. He was pressed into it. And then in the second part of verse 7 and verse 8, because of his prophetic office, Jeremiah had now become a continual laughingstock because all his messages were negative. He says, "I am become a laughingstock all the day. Everyone mocks me." He goes on to say, "For as often as I speak, I cry out, I cry, violence and destruction, because the word of Jehovah is made a reproach unto me and a derision all the day." So in verse 8, we see the reason for the mockery is that as often as he speaks, it's always a message of violence and destruction. And whenever he receives a prophetic utterance, it is always in the negative and never in the positive. Jehovah's word brought him nothing but disgrace and contempt. And as a result, when Jeremiah is attacked, the word of Jehovah is also under attack, and it's also mocked. It is derided day in and day out. Remember, these guys were worshiping Baal. And also, back in chapter 1, verse 10, Jeremiah had been commissioned to uproot and demolish. And that's why he continually proclaimed these threats of destruction, because his ministry was to uproot and demolish. Now, Jeremiah tells us what takes place. Verse 9. "And if I say I will not make mention of him," this is of Jehovah, "nor speak any more in his name, then there is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I'm weary with forbearing, and I cannot contain." So Jeremiah tells us what takes place on the occasions when he decided to no longer speak in God's name and decides to no longer be a prophet, trying to protect himself from the attacks. He says, "If I say I'll not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name," something takes place inside of him. There's something welling up inside of him. It says, "There is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire." Could have had heartburn. Whatever it is, it wells up with him so much that he suddenly finds himself compelled to prophesy the word of God. He is unable to remain silent for the purpose of avoiding the mockery and derision he knows will come. He simply cannot do it. He must prophesy. Can't contain it. And verse 10 describes exactly the way that Jeremiah is mocked. "For I have heard the defaming of many, terror on every side. Denounce and we will denounce him, say all my familiar friends. They that watch for my fall, peradventure he will be persuaded, and we shall prevail against him, and we shall take our revenge on him." Now, the very name that he gave to Pashhur back in verse 3 is now applied to Jeremiah by the people, because he hears the people calling him Magor-missabib, or terror on every side. So when he approaches people with a prophecy, oh, hang on, here he comes. He hears them mockingly say, here comes Mr. Magor-missabib, or here comes Mr. Terror on every side. Why? Remember, he's coming to prophesy terror and destruction. So denouncing, they denounce Jeremiah. Here comes Mr. Magor-missabib, Mr. Terror on every side. He never has anything good to say. And they're always waiting for him to fall. Now, even Jeremiah's most trusted friends encouraged one another to denounce him. So much for your friends. And they waited for his prophecies to remain unfulfilled. Now, since the first fulfillment did not come until 40 years later, after Jeremiah was installed as a prophet, they certainly felt that they had good grounds for mocking him. 40 years, mate, nothing's happened, all this destruction, and nothing's happened. They were hoping that if they kept harassing, he would stop speaking out, and that would be their revenge on him. If he does, at long last, they'll prevail against him. Now, what we see in verses 7 to 9 is a picture of despair, the despair of Jeremiah. I'm constantly being derided. I'm constantly being mocked. Why is there no peace for me? Now, verses 11 to 13, we see another side of Jeremiah's prayer life. This time it's one of joyful trust. And this we find in chapter 20, verses 11 to 13. Jeremiah says, but Jehovah is with me as a mighty one and a terrible. Therefore, my persecutors shall stumble, and they shall not prevail. They shall be utterly put to shame, because they have not dealt wisely, even with an everlasting dishonor, which shall never be forgotten. So, verse 11, Jeremiah recognizes that God is the mighty one and he is the terrible one. And this powerful Jehovah God is with Jeremiah. And he realizes that in the long term, his persecutors will stumble and fall. He recognizes that God has promised to preserve his life under all circumstances. He's already told them that. And that we saw back in, I think it was 1:19 and 15:20. He knows that ultimately his promises, God's promises, must come to pass. And the reason is that Jehovah was not just any God. He was Gibor Aritz. Gibor Aritz. And that means, oh, there it is there in the slide. Gibor Aritz, he is the mighty, terror-striking God. And in 15, verse 21, Jeremiah used the term Aritz for his enemies, calling them terrible or ruthless. Yet here he applied the term to Jehovah. He is Gibor Aritz. He is the mighty, terror-striking God. This mighty and terrible God would put Jeremiah's mockers to shame. They would experience failure and everlasting, unforgettable disgrace. And then going on into verse 12, Jehovah is also the righteous one. But, O Jehovah of hosts, that tries the righteous, that sees the heart and the mind, let me see your vengeance on them, for unto you have I revealed my cause. Because Jehovah is righteous and he tries the unrighteous, he sees the heart and the mind. Literally, he sees into their kidneys and minds, implying that he perceives their concealed motives and thoughts, which we know God does. So eventually, the righteousness of God must move out in judgment. And Jeremiah will someday see the vengeance of God upon his enemies. And his words in verse 12 are almost identical to his prayer back in chapter 11, verse 20. Perhaps this is one of the prayers he prayed often. And in verse 13, it now concludes this passage with a song of praise. Sing unto Jehovah, praise ye Jehovah, for he has delivered the soul of the needy from the hand of evildoers. So Jeremiah's expected deliverance is now a call to worship. It is the basis for his challenge to others to celebrate God's goodness with singing and praise to Jehovah. And this deliverance of his took place when Zedekiah succeeded Jeconiah. In verses 14 to 18, chapter 20, we now see that after expressing his joyful trust in Jehovah, Jeremiah ended the chapter on a negative note. We see here that he's going to curse the day of his birth. Verses 14 to 18 are reminiscent of Job 3. In Job 3, verses 3 to 12, I'll just read a couple of the verses. Job said, "Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night which said, there is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness. Let not God from above seek for it, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death claim it for their own. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let all that makes black the day terrify it." Now we're going to see that in verse 14, Jeremiah, just like Job, cursed the very day he was born. He followed the same pattern. He's not happy with the job God gave to him. He's not glorying in his prophetic office. It is not a job he enjoys. "Cursed be the day wherein I was born. Let not the day wherein my mother bare me be blessed." So what should have been good news, Jeremiah sees as a curse. And the good news was his birth. He goes on in verse 15, "Cursed be the man who brought tidings to my father, saying, a man-child is born unto you, making him very glad. And let that man be as the cities which Jehovah overthrew, and repented not. And let him hear a cry in the morning and shouting at noontime." So as Jeremiah thinks back upon what must have happened on the day he was born, in verse 15, the man who told his father, "Rejoice, you have a son," that man should be cursed as well. This is how Jeremiah is feeling. The word for tidings is the Hebrew word basar, B-A-S-A-R. And that's the word from which we get the word gospel. It means to give good news. It was good news which Jeremiah wished he had never been brought. Although Jeremiah's father was glad on the day of the birth of Jeremiah, his son, and as we learned earlier on, other sons of this same father would later on conspire against his life. But Jeremiah's father was very happy with this birth. But what happened? Jeremiah wished a curse upon the man who thought he was bringing good news, but in the long term, according to Jeremiah, it seemed like bad news for Jeremiah. And then in verse 16, Jeremiah wished that man to be like the cities which God overthrew in the plain. Now, as the cities which the Lord overthrew, now that is actually the technical term for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which Jeremiah employs. So deeply imprinted was the tradition on the Hebrew mind that a special word was appropriated to the overthrow of these two cities, which at once called up thoughts of the awful justice of God. So it's a technical term for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities which God overthrew. Now, verse 17, "Because he slew me not from the womb, and so my mother would have been my grave, and her womb always great." In verse 17, Jeremiah wished that he had been slain in the womb. Had the prophet been slain before his birth, his mother's womb would have been his grave. And then in verse 18, Jeremiah closes with questions of depression. "Why did I come forth from the womb to see labor and sorrow? that my days should be consumed with shame. His own despair is so all-consuming that all he can think about right now is some quick way out of this mess. For the moment, he has actually forgotten how Jehovah knew him before he came out of the womb, back in chapter 1, verse 5. For that was the exact place where he received his calling. Jeremiah was well named the weeping prophet, and we can understand why. As a man of sorrows, he was familiar with grief. And because of this similarity between Jeremiah and Jesus, some people thought that Jesus might be the prophet who had been raised from the dead. If we have a look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 14, we see this here. Now, when Jesus came into, this is Matthew 16, 13 to 14. Now, when Jesus came into the parts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Why would people have mistaken Jesus for Jeremiah? Well, according to Isaiah 53:3, Messiah would be despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, just like Jeremiah. Now, in this section, this section goes from chapter 21, verse 1 to 24, verse 10. We're going to see here that chapters 21 to 24 are going to build a unit that contains the 6 of Jeremiah's 8 messages. And the theme of the unit is Jeremiah's denunciation of Judah's kings, which we're going to see now in from 21:1 down to 23:8. And then we're going to see denunciation of false prophets in 23:9 to 40. So this section will end with the vision of the good and the bad figs down in 24:1 to 10, which we're not going to see today, but what we're going to see today is we're going to see the prophecies against Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah ruled from 597 to 586 BC. He was appointed king by Nebuchadnezzar at the time of the second deportation, and the previous king, Jehoiakim, was taken into captivity. Zedekiah ruled for 11 years, but he was a very weak king who bent to pressure from other members of the government, and he actually joined Egypt in a revolt against Babylon. Now, he's soon to suffer the consequences. His actions against Babylon were in direct contradiction to Jeremiah's own warnings and prophecies for him not to do that. And this incident took place around about 588 BC. 588. So he's been in power since 597. It's now 588. A couple more years, and the destruction of Jerusalem comes. The Babylonians were moving in against Jerusalem, and they were now getting ready to besiege the city. And so we're going to see a large historical section of the book. It's going to come later. So again, remember, Jeremiah's book is not chronological. Chapter 21, which is what we're doing now, chronologically falls between Jeremiah 37 and 38. This is the first time that Zedekiah sent a delegation to Jeremiah, and he's going to do a second time in Jeremiah 37, 3 to 10. So this is the fulfillment of a prophecy God gave to Jeremiah back in chapter 15, verse 11. Jehovah said, "Verily, I will strengthen you for good. Verily, I will cause the enemy to make supplication unto you in the time of evil and in the time of affliction." So God promised Jeremiah that the days would come when the very ones who mocked his prophecies would now come to him seeking the word of Jehovah. But at that time, it's going to be too late. Point of no return reached. So we see Zedekiah's inquiry in verses 1 to 2 of chapter 21. The word which came unto Jeremiah from Jehovah, when King Zedekiah sent unto him Pashhur, the son of Malchijah, and Zephaniah the son of Maaseiah, the priest, saying, okay, now, Pashhur, the Pashhur here of Jeremiah 21 is not the same Pashhur as Jeremiah 20, different father. He's the same Pashhur as we're going to find later on in Jeremiah 38, verse 1. The other person mentioned here is Zephaniah. Now, Zephaniah is the one who succeeded Pashhur mentioned in Jeremiah 20. Remember, the Pashhur of Jeremiah 20, he was a chief. He lost his position in light of Jeremiah's prophecy in Jeremiah 20, verses 1 to 6. Now, this guy is also going to be found in Jeremiah 29, 25 to 26 and 37, verse 3. The exact title of Pashhur, the son of Immer of chapter 20, which was the one Jeremiah changed his name, and Zephaniah, the son of Maaseiah in chapter 21, the titles that these two guys possess is the officer of the temple. So this makes him the second highest ranking official in the temple. These guys were only second to the high priest. So Pashhur of chapter 20, the son of Immer, was second. He was the officer of the temple. He was second to the high priest. In this chapter 21, we have another guy, Zephaniah. He is the one who's taken over from Pashhur. He is the officer of the temple. So this is a very high position. So Zedekiah sent high officials to inquire of Jeremiah. Zedekiah sent the second highest rank in the priestly order at that time. And this rank is described in 2 Kings 25, verses 18 to 25, and Jeremiah 52, 24 to 27. In verse 2 is the inquiry itself. Inquire, I pray thee, of Jehovah for us. For Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, maketh war against us. Peradventure Jehovah will deal with us according to all his wondrous works, that he may go up from us. So the reason for the inquiry was that Nebuchadnezzar had made war against Jerusalem. And the deeper reason, though, was that Nebuchadnezzar was making this war because of Zedekiah's own rebellion. Remember, Zedekiah went to the Egyptians to try and get some relief from Nebuchadnezzar. Zedekiah's rebellion would not have taken place if he had obeyed Jeremiah in the beginning. Now, for the first time, the king mentioned here is the one who will bring about Jerusalem's demise. It is Nebuchadnezzar, or your Bible might have Nebuchadrezzar. That's the Hebrew term. Earlier on, he had mentioned the nation which would destroy Judah, that was Babylon. Now, for the first time, he mentions the king who will destroy Babylon, Jerusalem, sorry. He's the king of Babylon. At this point, Zedekiah hoped, or he begins hoping for a miracle. Perhaps Jehovah will deal with us according to all his wonderful works, that the king may go away from us. Now, Zedekiah was hoping for a similar miracle as occurred back in the days of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah also disobeyed a prophet, Isaiah, and the Assyrians came against Jerusalem. Now, even though Hezekiah disobeyed the words of the prophet Isaiah, that was not the general characteristic of his rule. Hezekiah was a good king. He truly was a good king, and he truly repented of his act of disobedience. He trusted the Lord and did not lean upon foreign nations. He was miraculously rescued in Isaiah 37, verse 36. Different king, though. Zedekiah was an evil king, and he hoped that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, would go up from them as Sennacherib, the Assyrian, was forced to do in Isaiah 37:37. However, it was not going to happen again. In response to Zedekiah's inquiry, we're going to have three oracles in the rest of the chapter. In verses 3 to 7, we have Jehovah's answer concerning Zedekiah. Then said Jeremiah unto them, Thus shall you say to Zedekiah, Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, behold, I will turn back the weapons of war that are in your hands, wherewith you fight against the king of Babylon and against the Chaldeans that besiege you without the walls. And I will gather them into the midst of this city. So God's specific answer to Zedekiah is given in these verses here. The word that comes to Zedekiah in answer to his inquiry is in verses 3 to 4. Nebuchadnezzar will take Jerusalem. The weapons of the men of war of Jerusalem will be of no avail against the Babylonians besieging the city. The time is coming, and it's going to be within 2 years, because this is being prophesied in 588. Within 2 years of this inquiry, the Babylonians will break in. Jehovah himself would bring the Chaldeans all the way to the center of Jerusalem, where they would fill the streets of the city. Also, the reason the Babylonians will succeed without any doubt is in verses 5 to 6. Verse 5 says, and I myself will fight against you, that's against you, Judah, with an outstretched hand and with a strong arm, even in anger and in wrath and in great indignation. Because God will use the Babylonians to war against Jerusalem, in verse 5, God will fight personally against Jerusalem with an outstretched arm and with a strong arm. Those two, that should ring bells in your mind here, because with an outstretched arm, with a strong arm, these were the same figures that were used to describe the way that God brought Israel out of Egypt centuries earlier. Exodus 6:6 it only uses the arm alone, but Deuteronomy 4:34 and Deuteronomy 5:15 and 7:19, it says, by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm and by great terrors. Same thing. The same power that God used in Israel's behalf in the Exodus is now going to be used against them. It will be used in anger, wrath, and great indignation. And in verse 5, God himself will wage war against Jerusalem. In verse 6, God will smite the inhabitants of the city, both man and beast. They shall die of great pestilence. And the Hebrew word for pestilence is the word dever, D-E-V-E-R, also appears in Exodus 5:3 and Exodus 9:3. And what it's virtually saying is, just as he had caused pestilence to fall upon the Egyptians, he's now going to make it fall upon Judah. Their final state is spelled out in verse 7. And afterwards, says Jehovah, I will deliver Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his servants and the people, even such as are left in this city from the pestilence, from the sword, and from the famine, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of those that seek their life. And he shall smite them with the edge of the sword. He shall not spare them, neither have pity, nor have mercy. It's going to involve Zedekiah, who made the inquiry. It will involve the servants of Zedekiah and the people. Those who do not die by the tride that he used earlier, the tride was the sword, the famine, the pestilence, will fall into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. Now, among the members listed in these verses, Nebuchadnezzar will put many to death without sparing, without pity, without mercy. 2 times earlier, Nebuchadnezzar had taken the city. First, back in 606, 605 BC, and that was when the first deportation. Second, in 597 BC. And then in those 2 previous times, when he took the city, Nebuchadnezzar spared it. He only took away some people into captivity. But this time, he will not spare the city. And the historical fulfillment of this is found in 2 Kings 25, 6 to 7. It's also found in 2 Kings 25, 18 to 21, and also Jeremiah 52, 9 to 11, and 52, 24 to 27. Now, 2 Kings 25, 6 to 7. Then they took the king and carried him up unto the king of Babylon to Riblah, and they gave judgment upon him. And they slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and then put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in fetters and carried him to Babylon. So that's a fulfillment of what's going to happen to Zedekiah. Now we have the second oracle concerning Jehovah's answer to the people. This is in verses 8 to 10. And unto this people you shall say, thus says Jehovah, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He that abides in this city shall die by the sword, and by the famine, and by the pestilence. But he that goes out and passes over to the Chaldeans that besiege you, he shall live, and his life shall be unto him for a prey. So in verse 8, God gives the people a choice. The choice is between physical life and physical death. In verse 9, the way of death is to remain inside the city and attempt to fight off the Babylonians. Those who choose to remain in the city and fight off the Babylonians will die by the same triad: sword, famine, pestilence. Now, the way of life is to go outside and surrender to the Babylonians. And those who do so will have their life for a prey. Now, the expression, his life shall be unto him for a prey, that's an idiom for escaping with one's life only. So Jeremiah uses this phrase 3 more times in his book. We're going to see it in 38, verse 2, 39, verse 18, and 45, verse 5. Now, a similar choice was placed before the Jewish believers in the revolt against the Romans between AD 66 and 70. To stay behind and fight the Romans was the way of death. To abandon the city and leave the country was the way of life. This was for the Jewish believers. Now, the reason for all of this we find in verse 10. This is Jeremiah 21. For I have set my face upon this city for evil and not for good, says Jehovah. It shall be given into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire. So God has decreed the destruction of Jerusalem. God has given the city into the hand of the king of Babylon, and Jerusalem will be burned with fire. The third oracle we find in response to Zedekiah's inquiry deals with God's answer concerning the house of David in verses 11 to 14. And touching the house of the king of Judah, hear ye the word of Jehovah. O house of David, thus says Jehovah, execute justice in the morning and deliver him that is robbed out of the hand of the oppressor, lest my wrath go forth like fire and burn so that none can quench it, because of the evil of your doings. So in verse 11, God now addresses not one specific king as he did in verses 3 to 7 with Zedekiah, but he now addresses the royal house of David. The responsibility of the royal house of David is found in verse 12. They were to govern righteously. They were to execute justice in the morning. And the expression here, it says in the morning, it gives us a sense of urgency. Need to execute justice as quick as possible. They were to deliver him who was robbed from the hand of the oppressor. Nevertheless, these very responsibilities of the royal house were exactly where they failed. The term lest introduces a judgment for failure. Lest my wrath go forth like fire and burn so that none can quench it, because of the evil of your doings. So because the leadership of Jerusalem has failed so miserably, in verses 13 to 14, the judgment of God comes upon the entire city. Verse 13 says, behold, I am against you, O inhabitants of the valley and of the rock of the plain, says Jehovah. You that say, who shall come down against us, or who shall enter into our habitations? In verse 13, God is now against Jerusalem, and he uses 2 figures for Jerusalem here. First, behold, I am against you, O inhabitant of the valley. Now, Some claim that God was referring to the Tyropoean Valley, which in ancient times separated Mount Moriah from Mount Zion and emptied into the valley of Hinnom. However, it more likely refers to the fact that the mount upon which Jerusalem sits is lower than the surrounding mountains. It has the appearance of a valley. And also we see a similar figure is used for Jerusalem in Isaiah 22 verse 1, where Isaiah says it was the birth of the valley of the vision, speaking about Jerusalem. Jerusalem sits upon a mount, but being lower than the surrounding hills, it has the picture of a valley. Second, he calls Jerusalem the rock of the plain. Now, the rock of the plain is a reference to Mount Moriah or Mount Zion, which had a flat surface, and for that reason, it could be used as a threshing floor. And that threshing floor was bought by David and used by Solomon to build the temple. The reason that God is against Jerusalem in verse 13 is because of their proud statements. They were so sure that they would stand and withstand any invasion. Their confidence was based upon a misinterpretation of the events which occurred during the Assyrian invasion. Remember the Assyrian invasion, they turned back. They were at the gates, and then the Assyrians turned back and went back. They popularly said, "Who shall come down against us, or who shall enter our habitations?" They were boasting about history, what happened under Isaiah, back in the day of Isaiah. In verse 14, God spells out the punishment upon Jerusalem. "And I will punish you according to the fruit of your doings, says Jehovah, and I'll kindle a fire in her forest, and it shall devour all that is round about her." So God would punish the inhabitants of Jerusalem because of all the rebellions, violations, and evils they had committed against him. "I'll kindle a fire in her forest, and it shall devour all things around her." The term forest was a figure used here and elsewhere for the royal palace. It was used for describing the royal palace in places like 1 Kings 7 verses 2 to 5 and Isaiah 22 verse 8. So not only will Jerusalem in general burn, but also the royal palace itself will be put to the torch. And in chapter 22, he continues with the theme of prophecies against Judah. And this is where we leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.